Okay, hello everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon rather than sitting in the sunshine. Very dedicated. My name is Vic Wakefield-Jarrett. I work for Centre for Sustainable Energy. And today's webinar is part of the Innovation Lab webinar series. So we've been having about once a month featuring projects from the Next Generation scheme, which is a innovation scheme for community energy groups funded by Power to Change. And we've also hosted some webinars from other community energy groups who haven't been included in this in the programme. The idea is to share knowledge and learning and examples from people actually on the ground doing these projects. So not necessarily experts, that everybody here will have some experience and some useful knowledge to contribute, but the idea is to highlight, to showcase projects that have been funded. Okay, can I have the next slide, Chris? So just to say, the webinar has been recorded and it will be shared online afterwards, and there's a host of other webinars available online as well on the Next Gen website. This is the 10th in a series, and we've definitely got 2 more coming up. So just very quick run through the Zoom controls. You'll be able to see the participant list. It's probably at the bottom of your screen, and there you can, if you click on the 3 dots next to your name, there's a more option, and that allows you to rename yourself. We would ask that people include the name of their organisations in their names. It just helps add some context in the chat when people are asking questions. You can also mute yourself and choose to turn your video on or off there as well. We'd ask that you keep muted throughout the presentation. When we get, and probably throughout the whole webinar, when we get to the question and answer session, we may choose to invite people to unmute and ask their question if they need further detail. It's probably best to keep your videos off while the presentation is happening, because that just helps with bandwidth if anybody's struggling with their internet. So yeah, about the questions, if you have a question, you're welcome to put them in the chat box, which you should be able to see an option for at the bottom of your screen. We will take all the questions after the presentation. My colleague Megan is here to help if you've got any technical difficulties. Do you want to give a wave, Megan? So you can message her in the chat box. You can choose just to message Megan and she'll try and help you. Okay, so just wanted to check that everyone can see the screen. It should be a presentation being shown. If you can't, then you can select the view options in the top right corner, and that should be able to ask you if you want to see the screen. Okay, can I have the next slides, Chris? So just a brief overview, we're going to have about half an hour. Chris Stewart-Bennett from Carbon Gordano is going to give a presentation on the Lockleaze Loves Solar project. And then we'll take a little bit of time after that. I'll be asking him some specific questions. And then following that, there'll be a Q&A session where we'll be taking the contributions from the chat box. And Megan will be hosting that section. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Chris now to start the presentation. If people could take their videos off just while the presentation's going on, that would be great. Thank you.
Good afternoon,
Chris.
all. Thank you, Vic. Yes, good afternoon, all. As Vic said, I'm going to run you through the findings that we've had from the past 2 years of investigating Lockleaze Loves Solar. But first, a little context. So when the feed-in tariff was removed a few years back, we were hit with a problem where we needed to find a different financial model for community energy. Feed-in tariffs had supported a lot of community energy schemes over the years that they ran, but standard export wasn't really enough to pay back the investments required for solar energy, that's any renewable energy provided by community energy. So in early 2018, David Saunders, who I have seen in the audience, approached Carbon Gordano, of which I'm a director, with an initial proposal, which was to refinance our existing solar farms and use the money from that to pay for community solar. And we did a year or so of preliminary investigation looking into how viable that would be, and eventually realized that it was not really a workable financial approach, but it was still an interesting topic to have investigated. And just as we were wrapping up that concept, Power to Change and CSE launched the Next Generation scheme, which gave us the money that would fill in the shortfall that would potentially make it workable in terms of doing the upfront feasibility studies. And if that worked, we would then be able to proceed on to actual implementation. David, my fellow director, Bob Langton, and myself had a chat and realized that we had a common ally in the form of Suzanne Wilson, who isn't here at the moment, who's the lead of Lockleaze Neighbourhood Trust. And so we reached out to her, David and I, with the seed of an idea. And from that, the original concept of Lockleaze Loves Solar was born. Spoken about the initial analysis, and I've spoken about the Next Generation Energy Scheme. So what did we want to do with Lockleaze Loves Solar? The intent was to install about a megawatt of rooftop PV across about 300 pre-existing properties. So this would be retrofit rather than incorporated into new build, which would be funded with a £1 million community share raise or thereabouts. We weren't fixed to those numbers. They were orders of magnitude that we wanted to aim for. And that would have resulted in about 3.3 kilowatts of solar installed on each roof. In order to make a business model out of it, we needed to partner with an energy supplier who would manage the sale of PV generated electricity, which would be sold to the occupants and the consumers at lower than grid prices, which would help address fuel poverty. The intention was to focus on properties that were in more deprived parts of Bristol and increase renewables uptake amongst those who might not otherwise be able to pay for an installation. So we front up the capital, we stick the panels on the roofs, they still get a benefit. We would then pay back the community investors that gave us the money through the fundraise over a 25-year period via the surplus that would be generated by the financial model. And we would develop a replicable business model that could be handed over to any other area, whether that's other areas in Bristol or other areas around the country, to be used by any group. Lockleaze Neighbourhood Trust, so Suzanne Wilson, provided the main thrust of our direct community engagement. They have a very active community hub in Lockleaze, so she was running events and providing local publicity and generally getting the message of what we were trying to do out to the population. Before COVID and the sale of Bristol Energy hit us, the intention was for local Lockleaze residents to be hired to work as door knockers and engagement champions, so effectively going street by street, asking people if they'd heard about the scheme, whether they'd be interested, and signing them up to the initial feasibility, the preliminary suitability studies. We had some engagement with Bristol City Council, but it was fairly evident that they had their own plans tied into City Leap, so we had to remove any council properties from our pool of potential locations for installation. However, I understand they're moving on with that themselves. Likewise, we had some engagement with the active community housing schemes in the area. Generally, we just had bad timing with those. They'd either signed contracts and finalised plans for new builds that they were going to do, or had plans in motion to do it themselves. So we were left really with a situation where we could only look at properties that were privately owned and rented out, or owned and occupied by people within Lockleaze. If we had proceeded to the installation phase, which obviously COVID and Bristol Energy's disintegration kind of kiboshed, the intent had been to use the supplier that we partnered with to train up local residents as installers. This would have expedited the build process as well as increasing local employment. So what actually happened? Well, COVID hit us, and that pretty much knackered any opportunity to go around and do direct face-to-face engagement with people. Then fairly rapidly after that, Bristol Energy disintegrated, and with it, the energy supplier that we had been partnering with and had moved to a fairly advanced level in terms of working out how the billing and charging of customers would have worked. We discovered multiple additional costs of operation, which, although each of them were relatively small, they nibble away at the financial viability of the model. To run this as a business with the appropriate fiduciary responsibilities that come with having a business and looking after other people's investments, there are more regulatory overheads than you might have if you were just installing solar panels on your own roof. But we did develop a replicable business model that could be used by in other areas by other groups if they can find an energy supplier to work with, and if a couple of variables improve just a little bit more. And I'm now going to go through the various variables that we used, how you can tweak them, and how the model is nearly there. It will work, just not yet. It's a year, maybe two, away from viability, assuming the existence of an energy supplier that we can work with. So to talk you through the inputs and assumptions, anything that's in a green box was broadly under our control, and we could tweak that to an extent, or we could negotiate with people to try and change prices. Anything that was in an orange box is effectively outside of our control. So array size, it's up to us to decide how many panels we stick on the roofs, so we have control over that. The cost per panel, the latest quote we had from November 2020 was at £50 a panel. There is probably some bulk purchase wiggle room on that. Equally, panel prices have been on a downward trend. There was a slight upward blip due to supply issues, but I suspect they will continue to move downwards. So that's a variable that we could tweak to see whether the model will work in the future. Installation costs and the inverters and cabling are broadly fixed costs, so they don't really change over time. And again, they're from the quotation we had from the installer in 2020. Battery costs. Batteries are getting cheaper. This is for a 2 kilowatt battery. The installation costs, actually I've put that in green, it's probably not under our control again, it's a fairly fixed installation fee. Cost of sales, this was the time spent by our paid door knockers, and we were working on the assumption of approximately 6 hours from first contact to sign up, which comes to about £100. And then legal fees, that was from a quotation from Foot Anstey, who we were using as our legal partners for the cost of sorting out the lease on the roof, because you have to have that legal protection in place, both for homeowners, because of the mortgage council mortgage lenders require that in order for you to loan out your roof to a third party, and it provides legal protections for the business. We originally modelled on the grid electricity price of 16 pence, but the average is now more like about 20. So I have updated this model to reflect that. And we initially modelled on an electricity sale price. We first looked at 10 pence, but then in conversations with Bristol Energy, they said they'd need to add on an extra tuppence per kilowatt hour in terms of administration costs. So a baseline electricity sale price of 12 pence. Annual self-usage, that's an average assuming 10 kilowatt hours per day. Self-use 35% here. It actually drops down a little bit when we do look at the first version of the model. It's sort of assumed average of 25% of the power that most properties use will be used by the property. The rest goes to the grid. The export rate, 5 pence is about industry average at the moment, so I put that in there as that. And the annual generation per kilowatt, that's effectively fixed by the level of insolation in the area, which for Bristol is about 900 kilowatts per year per kilowatt installed. We've assumed a 2% inflation, factors in those admin costs of 2 pence will come out of this energy price. O&M was a quotation from our suppliers, and the interest rate of 4% is below what we, Low Carbon Gordano, have paid for other schemes, but seemed like a reasonable sum with which to offer investment. So moving on to how our baseline model looked. If you look in the cash flow to the bottom right, I've cut out the years 6 through 19 because otherwise the table would be huge and unwieldy. But what we're really looking for is in the bottom right 5 rows for cash flows, the ones that are currently highlighted in red. They need to all be green for this to be a not horribly risky project. All these numbers in this model assume that nothing goes wrong, that none of your customers move away or decide they want to leave the scheme or anything like that. So we have to work on the assumption that if it doesn't work at year 20, it's unlikely to work at all. So, tweaking some of the variables, you'll see in the previous slide, I'd assume that 25% self-use. However, with the advent of a lot of working from home, more people are likely to be at home during the day, so they can maximize their solar generated electricity. So I've upped the self-use to 40%, as you'll see highlighted there. This does improve the numbers. So if you remember the original model, we were looking at about £3,000 in the red for the years 20 through 25. We're now down to 2,500. It's still not viable with that level of self-use, but it's better than it was. So what happens if we add more panels? I've modeled it on 2.7 kilowatts installed because that's how much I've got on my roof, and I could check the numbers against that. But if we increased it to 3.3, so that's 11 300-watt panels on the roof, but kept the self-use drops a little bit because you're generating more power, so a smaller percentage of that power actually gets used, but you're still looking at about a megawatt of power used from the solar each year. Again, the cash flow numbers continue improving. We're now down to only £1,600 in the red. Those numbers need to get into the green, so positive figures, before this is really a viable scheme. So what happens if we put up the cost of the electricity that we're selling to people? Well, that works. So we're now looking at in the green for, although it's showing as negatives, it's actually positive numbers there. That works, but at 17 pence sale for self-used electricity, there's not really much incentive at all for people to sign up to it. They're saving maybe £31 a year in return for all the disruption of having the panels put on their roof. And you can, if you shop around really well, get less than 17 pence for your grid electricity rate. So we didn't think that that level of price would be appealing enough for enough people to sign up to the scheme to make it viable. And what if we paid a lower interest rate? So dropping the interest rate down to 3%, but also bringing the electricity price down to about 15 pence. So they are still making a bit of a saving. This almost works, but not quite. The problem being that at 3%, I think we'd have trouble getting sufficient investment into the scheme because there are other higher paying community energy schemes out there, and there's only a finite amount of investor capital available. So that's probably a bit too high risk and unlikely to get funded. Well, if we added batteries, I mean, that's going to increase the self-use, and indeed it does. If you put in the batteries, self-use goes up to 60%, and that's great, except these 2 kilowatt-hour batteries would be cycling at least once, if not twice a day, and they have a relatively short lifespan. So we'd actually have to replace those batteries 2, maybe 3 times within the course of the project. And that totally breaks the financial model. They aren't really a workable option if you're going for small batteries. If you went for larger batteries, they'd last longer, but they cost commensurately more. Now, if we could get panel prices down to £20 per panel, which if you continue with the gentle decline, they will eventually reach, the model totally works, but panel prices aren't there at the moment. So we need to wait a little bit longer on that. If we got the export rate up, so if we were to put the export rate up to 6.2 pence per kilowatt hour exported, again, the model works, but there aren't any suppliers that we can work with at the moment who are offering 6.2 pence on a guaranteed 25-year export rate. Because bear in mind, you need to be certain that you have this income coming in for the financial model to work. How about if we look at a balance between the two? So an export rate of 5.7 pence, a panel cost of £40 per 300-watt panel. So the panel price is probably only 6, maybe 12 months away. And that 5.7 pence is only 0.2 of a pence above the current export rate that Octopus provide. So those are very nearly there. And that model, it works. Everything's in the green down in the bottom right. That would be a safe enough investment to go for, but it's not there just yet. Like I said, give it another year or so, hopefully those two variables will move in the right direction. Possibly panels will drop further and therefore you don't need the higher export rate. But that would get you to a state where this scheme would work. However, at the moment, because of the absence of an energy supplier and because of the current state of the variables that we can't control, it's not. So a summary of the learnings. The hidden costs of running a business really eat into the financial viability. The need to have insurance on the panels, the need to pay for operations and maintenance so that insurance is valid, the need to have leases rather than you just being the person that sticks panels on your own roof and not needing a lease there, the need to pay people, whether they're individuals who are doing the administration costs if you're trying to run your own energy supply business, which with the advent of the local electricity bill may make a viable option, or if you're paying to an external energy supplier to do that work for you. Those have costs. They can't be done by volunteers because you need people available 24/7 in order to support customers, because if their electricity goes down, they want you to fix it there and then. They don't want you to come along in a week or two when your volunteers are available. They need it done now. Export rates, as I said, need to rise slightly, and they have to have a longer term guarantee for models like this to work. On the one hand, energy prices are going up, so we may see a commensurate increase in export rates as a result. On the other hand, as more and more renewables hit the grid, that's going to put a downward pressure on export rates because of supply and demand. So I'm not optimistic that export rates will go up significantly. But as I said, if panels fall far enough, we shouldn't need to worry about that. Batteries as they currently stand, as I say, are something of a false economy. Battery technology needs to improve so that the batteries last a lot longer, or they need to become significantly cheaper to really be able to fit into a knife edge margin scheme such as this. And we need to find an energy supplier who will work with community energy organisations on this. Many of you will know that Octopus are doing their energy local schemes at the moment, but those are still very much in a pilot stage. And despite David's endeavours to contact them and have conversations, they don't seem to be in a position at the moment where they're willing to talk to us. The one thing I would highlight is that if you're doing a solar only with no battery type approach, time of use tariffs as they currently stand probably won't work if you're focusing on addressing fuel poverty. The solar generation curve is a peak in the middle of the day, but as the solar generation drops off at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, that's when the time of use tariffs jump from 19-ish pence to 35 pence per kilowatt hour. And that's when most people use their power. So you will see much higher bills if you're on a purely solar and time of use tariff model. So what next, and what will we do differently? Well, we are going to continue monitoring the market, and we're going to keep an eye on those variables that I mentioned before. And if they start moving towards a viable level, then we will revisit this, and we will continue trying to engage with energy suppliers, because without an energy supplier, there probably isn't a way of doing this. I mean, I mentioned the local electricity bill, but the cost of operating as an energy company is a lot higher than people believe or people understand. And it only really works with economies of scale. So 300 houses, probably not going to work. You need more like 10,000. And the time taken to ramp up to that may be a bit of a showstopper on that, which is why existing energy suppliers should be the stopgap until that level of customer base has been established. And we'll keep looking for other potential grant funding to mitigate the capital cost of the panels. I mean, if we could get 50% capital funding, that would drop those panel prices down to the equivalent of £25. That's suddenly taking us much closer to where we need to be. And that would make the project far more viable. But grant funding, although it exists, is fought over by everyone and often comes with a lot of constraints that render it unsuitable for the schemes we're trying to do. So if I were to do it all over again, and indeed if any of you tried to replicate this, should know your costs, and you should test your models to destruction. And by that, I mean, put in the worst possible scenario you can think of, everything going wrong, and see if you can make it work. And if you can make it work when everything goes wrong, you've got a bulletproof financial model. If it only works when you put in the things that might work, the best case scenario, if we can achieve this, you're planning for failure because you're not modeling reality. Moving on to the questions, Vic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. That was a really fascinating presentation. Really good to see how much work went in. There's obviously a lot of detail modelling that went in there. So I'm just going to ask Chris a few set questions now. They will repeat some of the content that was in the presentation, but we find it is helpful just to draw out a few of the key targets. So firstly, Chris, where did the need for your project originate? So maybe talk about what you were trying to achieve by doing it.
Well, from a community point of view, there was an awareness that solar is solar in general and community solar at the moment is kind of a middle class thing. It's people with money who invest in it for large solar farms or rooftop schemes where they get most of the benefit. And yes, a school or a community building may get some free solar, but for the most part, it's a middle class issue and benefit. And we felt that it needed to be made more equitable. Other parts of society who seemed to be being missed out in the community energy revolution needed to be incorporated. And so that was where Lockleaze came in as a particularly appealing scheme. David had already done a very small scale solar installation there about 10 years ago. And we had the good relationship with Suzanne. So there was a need to try and get solar power to less affluent communities so that they would get a benefit and be engaged in addressing climate change and joining the clean energy revolution. From a low carbon point of view, we were looking for new projects, and this seemed like a very good fit for our ideals and also from a financial model basis. So it was jokingly said in our steering group meetings that Carbon Gordano brought the corporate side of things. David brought the idealism and Suzanne brought the engagement with the community. But it was sort of a happy combination of those things that started the scheme off. And then, as I mentioned, we didn't think it was workable with our first investigation of it, but then when the next generation scheme came in, that potential seed funding to do the viability work meant it was worth revisiting, and it would reduce the definite cost overrun that we were facing when we first looked at it.
Thank you. And who were the key partners for the project, and maybe say about what their motivations were for getting involved, or how, if you had a history of those partners? Yeah,
so Lockleaze Neighbourhood Trust was the key partner. Without their engagement with the community, we'd have just been a bunch of people from somewhere else coming in and trying to install solar in Lockleaze, and I don't think we would have been received particularly warmly. Then in terms of installers, we ran a tender process and eventually settled on a company called IDEA. Now, they do the Solar Street scheme, which some of you may have heard reported on what we've done in Frome and other areas around the UK. They are a scaffolding and solar installers, so they provide the entire package for getting things in. We worked very well with them until COVID hit, and I think they went quiet due to business constraints. The quote that I referenced from November 2020 was actually from another installer that David had sourced in Bristol, though we never really worked with them, so they don't really count as key partners. In terms of legal support, I mentioned Foot Anstey. They got involved because they wanted to give back to the community, and some of the people that we worked with in Foot Anstey live very proximately to Lockleaze, so they had a local interest in the concept. And then Bristol Energy was the only energy company that would speak to us, but they were Bristol based and therefore had an interest in progressing this within the Bristol area.
Thank you. And what social impacts did you intend to have from the project?
So we intended to help address fuel poverty by reducing people's energy bills. So on the standard model, you'd have been looking at between sort of £60 to £90 a year energy bill reductions for the people participating in the scheme, which is a sizable chunk if you're in fuel poverty and you're having trouble paying your bills. We also intended to create a number of jobs in Lockleaze, both through the sort of potential customer engagement side of things and also ongoing support and sort of current customer support, and through the installer training scheme that IDEA had proposed that they'd run. So it should have been to steal Boris's phrase, a levelling up opportunity for skills, jobs, and environmental awareness within Lockleaze.
Thank you. That's really interesting, and yeah, different to that. Maybe the main difference to if a corporate had tried to roll out this scheme, that commitment to really delivering local, local jobs and involvement. So the next question I have is, what environmental impacts did you aim to have? I mean, that's one of the core tenets of most community energy groups, but I mean, yeah, maybe just
we aimed to have a megawatt of solar on people's roofs, demonstrating that community energy was a viable thing. And I mean, that would have been somewhere in the order of the math has gone. Well, almost a gigawatt of solar generation a year, effectively, which would have had a commensurate carbon impact. Sadly, we never actually got any panels on the roofs, so I don't think we achieved much in the way of climate benefits other than having lots of meetings via Zoom rather than meeting each other when COVID stopped us from meeting each other.
So you've touched on this a bit, but what would be the potential for the project to be replicated by other groups in other parts of the country? And what would they need to consider? You mentioned the relationship with Bristol Energy. I wondered if that was the geographical proximity to cooperative, like a helpful energy company was something that was core to your business design.
The helpful energy company at the moment really is quite essential for this to work. Yes, the local electricity bill may empower us all to start acting as energy suppliers, but I don't think that it will prove to be financially viable for most small organisations to do that, at least in the short term. So having an energy company that you can work with that has a footprint in the areas we are trying to do a scheme like this is fairly key. They need to manage the billing and charging, the meter reading and charging aspects of it. Smart meters help a lot, but there is always human interaction required in order to just check that metering and issue the right bills and deal with customer support issues that might come up. So you can't just simply run it as an automated process, and you can't run it with volunteers. You need people available all the time. So in principle, this scheme could be replicated anywhere. In practice, the further north you go, the less sunlight will be hitting the panels. So you have to be installing more absolute generation to achieve the same amount of power to make the financial model work. So I would probably suggest that anywhere north of Birmingham probably won't work at even the £40 panel price that I mentioned before. But if panels were to drop to £30, then you can probably move a little bit further north and start doing it further up the country. In the southwest, we are blessed with lots and lots of sun beating down on the ground, as is being demonstrated outside at the moment, and that makes the total power generated by each panel that much higher. But those two considerations borne in mind, the rest of it is replicable. You find a community that has an appropriate number of suitable properties, whether that's council-owned properties if the council will work with you, or privately owned properties if they won't. We have template leases available on the Power to Change website that can be taken. Foot Anstey have given their permission for anyone to take those and adapt them as they see fit. So that saves you a whole bunch of legal fees in terms of actually putting together the baseline lease agreement for the roofs. We have a financial model again, which is available on the Power to Change website, which will allow you to put in your particular variables and see whether this is something that's financially viable for you at whatever price you wish to charge. We have the documents that describe what we tried and what the principle was behind it. I mean, ultimately, what it boils down to is sticking solar panels on people's roofs with an inverter inside and having them linked up to an energy supplier that we have an agreement with. And when you sign up with the supplier, you reference a certain sign-up code, and that puts you in the Lockleaze Loves Solar or Bristol Loves Solar, or whatever you want to call it, billing bundle. And they then know that they will check the PV generation meter and go, okay, it generated this much power, and they'll check the export meter and they'll go, it exported 80% of that, so we'll bill them for the 20% that they used, or exported 20% of that, which means we bill them for 80%. That's how the billing bit would be managed by that energy company. And I think Octopus are probably going to be the leading candidates to speak to if they decide that Energy Local works for them, and if they can either tweak their agile time of use tariff, which is what they generally seem to be putting people on Energy Local on, or will be willing to go for more of a fixed rate, so you don't get those 35 pence per kilowatt hour spikes in the late afternoon, which really just break everything unless you've got big batteries there to take advantage of the cheaper electricity during the other times of the day.
So you planned this to happen in Lockleaze. Was there any particular reason why that neighbourhood was good in terms of the type of housing or the density or the number of housing in a certain area? Or was it more because you had a good relation already with the...
I mean, the housing in Lockleaze is particularly suitable to it. It's got, if you've been to Lockleaze, a lot of the properties are big, flat, plain roofs with relatively small amounts of roof furniture, so chimney pots and aerials and things like that. So you can potentially get quite a lot of panels on a roof without too much difficulty, and they're all sort of fairly straight-sided, so getting scaffolding up or the easy deck quick installation solution that one of the providers had shown us, actual installation would be relatively straightforward. The inverter would probably need to go in the loft, because I imagine most people's houses are quite full nowadays, and inverters are not small things. But building fabric wise, Lockleaze was really quite suitable. That wasn't particularly why we chose it. It was a happy side effect. It was really because of the conversations that David and I had with Suzanne, and the knowledge that Lockleaze is in one of the higher deprivation areas in Bristol. And the theory is if we could make it work there, it would work anywhere.
Excellent, thank you. And just one final question from me. What are the key lessons learned that you think people should know? Or maybe if you were starting again, knowing what you know now, like what would you have made sure to know at the beginning?
I think we should have understood all the costs involved earlier than we did. It was a very iterative process. So we started off with a, looking back on it, woefully enthusiastic model, which didn't account for the actual true cost of what was involved in doing this in real life. And as we gradually added more and more extra costs, as we realized that we needed O&M costing, even if it's only at £10 per kilowatt or so, it still adds up, and we needed insurance, because if there was a wiring fault from our systems and it burnt down someone's house, yeah, we needed to be able to cover that. But equally, if any of our kit broke, there is a provision within that financial model for repairs and replacements, but only for wear and tear. If a lightning storm shorted out 50% of the panels in the scheme, we wouldn't have been able to replace that and keep the project viable without a measure of insurance to ensure that continuity of operation and equipment. And as you start adding these things up, they as you've seen from the financial models, they just nibble away at the profits until suddenly you realize you don't have a surplus, and you can't pay back your investors, and actually the scheme is more and more expensive each year compared to when it was first installed. So understanding that from the very beginning, I think, would have been the key thing to do, and being far harsher with our model from the beginning. So really trying to break it. There's a phrase, steel manning, where a straw man is where you create a weak version of an argument and you defeat it easily. Steel manning is where you make the strongest possible version of an argument that you're trying to defeat. So arguing from your opponent's point of view, and then you try and defeat the steel man. And if you can defeat the steel man, you'll easily defeat the real world equivalent. So we should have steel manned our model far harder than we did earlier on. Yeah, I mean, those are the two things that I would do far earlier next time. That probably would have identified that this wasn't a workable model far earlier than it did.
Okay, great, thanks, Chris. I'm going to hand over to Megan now, who's going to host the Q&A section for the next half hour or so.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, we've had a few questions come in and also some questions that I have too, but I'll wait until we address the other ones in the chat first. So our first question is from Tess, who recently joined us at CSE. Welcome, Tess. Asking, have you collaborated with any other groups across the country doing similar things? Or, you know, have you kind of spoken about it with other groups as well?
So we have spoken about it with other groups involved in the next gen scheme, though none of them are doing quite this sort of model. And I've spoken with groups who've been doing sort of effectively virtual power grids, so almost electrically gated communities, in so much as they all run off the same local grid and there's one single link out to the main grid, and they do some power generation and share it within their community. But again, that's not quite the same as this model. This model was retrofitting at large scale onto a community and trying to create a virtual power grid spread across an energy supplier. So, I mean, I'm not aware of anyone else that's actively tried to do that model. And so, no, we haven't collaborated with them. However, if there are, Tess, I'd be interested to know about them, because we may be able to have some discussions there. But we were trying to do something slightly different from the sort of local power networks model.
Yeah. Okay, great, thank you. And we've got a question from Gillian from Chester Community Energy, asking, well, mentioning that a recent survey of community energy members suggested that they would accept as low as a 1% to 2% interest on their investment if there was clear decarbonisation benefit for the community, which is quite useful to know. Gillian, if you're able to send a link for an article on that, that would be great. And then it also, she asks, you also mentioned that there were higher paying community energy schemes out there, and what are they?
Yeah, well, so certainly Oxford Low Carbon Hub are paying between 4 and 5.5% on even recent fundraisers there. I believe Beck's recent fundraise was certainly above 3, though I didn't look at it in detail. BWCE, I believe, are somewhere in the 4 to 5% range at the moment. So that those schemes still seem to be paying at a level above the 3%. I haven't seen that survey of community energy members that say they would accept that low level of interest. I may be being cynical, but if they were presented with 2 opportunities that both showed decarbonisation benefits, and one was paying 3% and the other was paying 4%, I think the money would flow to the 4% one faster than it would flow to the 3% one, just because people are people.
Yeah, can I just come back on that? So
yeah,
the survey that I mentioned was one that we recently did with Community Energy England, and that was specifically the Chester members. So the results haven't been formally published yet. And there was a spread, without a doubt. There are some people who said no, they wouldn't accept anything less than 4 or 5%. But I think it links to what you said before about solar PV arrays have been seen as very middle class. And there's a sort of moral guilt, I think, beginning to sink in that in this day and age, is it right that investors who have spare money around can sit on 4% from community energy projects, when there's a significant number of people who are saying that they would be happy if there was a strong community benefit, if there was a strong decarbonisation benefit, to almost view it, dare I say, almost like a charitable gift for small donations, crowdfunding, that sort of thing. So that was the context of what I was saying before. In answer to what you were saying about the higher paying community energy schemes, my understanding is a lot of the percentages you're quoting are based on models that still qualify for the FIT because they were registered before the scheme ended, right? Or are there schemes out there paying the 3 to 4% without any feed-in tariff?
I believe quite a few of them are. So the recent fundraisers are not eligible FIT, but are still managing that sort of interest rate. I mean, going back to your 1 to 2 interest rate, 1 to 2% interest rate and the moral guilt, I hope you're right. I do, and maybe we'll see over the coming years that there is a progression towards that. But I wonder whether the people that responded in that position were all the people that felt that, and the people that didn't respond didn't want to say that out loud. And so you still probably not got enough for £1 million fundraise, I guess. But yeah, I'm sure there will be a cultural shift, and people may well start to accept lower interest rates on community energy as part of that. It's the right thing to do, but I don't think it's there at this time, which is why this project isn't viable right now on the numbers that I quoted.
Thanks, Gillian, for sharing that, though. That's really useful. And we've got a couple questions from Mark from, excuse me if I pronounce this one, Chetwynd Neighbourhood Forum. Going back to the kind of replication side of things, asking if they could have a copy of your model, if that's available, and also would you be willing to work with groups wanting to set something similar up?
Yes, you can have a copy of the model, and yes, if you want to contact me separately, I'm happy to talk you through what you're trying to do and where we would advise you look else, what we would advise you look at. Actively working with you, I've now taken on a real job, so I have a lot less time in my day than I used to, but drop me a line and we'll see what comes out of it.
Another question from Mark is what differences would be required for new build applications? So this is in context of 1,500 homes being built in their area by 2028. And
okay, so new build. So I didn't go into this because it wasn't the model that we were looking at, but new build has the potential to work quite well. David Saunders, who is in here, and maybe we can get him to pop in at some point to talk about one of his things, or if you contact him separately. He's been looking into new build models where you spread the cost of some or all of the solar through a very long-term mortgage model, which makes the financials a lot better, because effectively it's going back to that. You've bought solar for your own house and installed it, except you bought the house with the solar integrated. So that you don't have to have all the lease and the O&M side of things. That makes the model work a lot better. You also make a lot of savings on the installation costs, because if the solar can be installed at the same time as the roof is being put on, you don't need to put scaffolding up twice, which makes everything much more cost effective. So if you can find a new build scheme nearby that's doing it, engage with them immediately, get in right before the planning gets finalised, and get the panels in there, whether it's you funding it or you helping put together a model and providing consultancy on it. That's the way to get solar onto these sorts of properties, because that I think would work given the current variables. There was one that is happening in Lockleaze, but unfortunately it happens outside the funding timeframe of Power to Change, so we weren't able to get involved in it.
Am I allowed to carry on with that?
Yeah, go for it.
We've got, as I said, we've got 1,300 or 1,500 new build houses by 2028, and then 4,500 over the next 20 years or so, and 18,000 square meters of office space being built. So, and our idea was to use that to sort of kickstart integrating back into the existing area.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you have a fantastic opportunity there, and it's definitely worth pursuing.
That's great news.
They're in North Somerset, all the new properties that are going to be built around here are going to be. I suspect we'll be doing much the same thing and trying to have conversations with developers so that we can partner with them to get far more than the minimum mandatory required 2 solar panels per roof that building regs currently require.
Great. Thank you, Chris, and thanks, Mark. A question from Harriet from CSE. What would need to happen for other energy suppliers to engage with community models like this?
Oh, I think they probably need all of us banging on their doors to show that there's a market out there for them to actually engage with. I believe David was contacting OVO and Octopus on a near weekly basis, and we'd occasionally get some very brief interested emails and then not actually get anything else. But I think if as many community energy organisations as are listening to this and have the energy and enthusiasm and want to get involved in these sorts of schemes as possible, if they can all start contacting the greener energy suppliers and show that there is an appetite for this sort of work, then there will be a reason for those energy suppliers to start coming up with a solution.
Yeah, and I think related to this, I'll ask one question that I thought of as well is, obviously there are things that you stated as out of your control and things which are kind of the energy suppliers and policies and things like that. Are there any plans to kind of have these conversations following from this, from you as an organisation or from next generation kind of wider dissemination? Are there any kind of outputs that people can show to suppliers that they're talking to about this project?
I'm not aware of any next gen specific ones, but that's not to say that Power to Change and CSE haven't got ideas in the background that they're gradually drawing together evidence for. I think organisations like Community Energies England and Regen may be a good channel for putting lobbying activity through, though again I haven't explored that further. We've now finished the investigation of Lockleaze Loves Solar and determined that at this time it doesn't work, therefore we have to close down the scheme slightly early because there was nothing more to achieve with the money and it was better to return it. So we have other projects that we're looking at, but I think there is a need for that conversation with those energy suppliers. I just don't know what form it will take.
Yeah, I'm guessing a lot of learnings will be pulled out from the evaluation of next generation as a whole as well, which would be provide quite useful outputs, I reckon. Okay, so a question from N. Elliott. Did you run the model for grid parity prices? It wouldn't solve fuel poverty, but it would increase renewable energy use and generation.
I think that's possibly following on from his earlier question about missing the beginning of the presentation, the model of energy sales. So the model was any power generated by the panels on the roof would be sold to the occupier of the property at a less than grid price. How much less than is a sliding scale that can be used to try and make the financial model work. But at the end, I got to about 15 pence per kilowatt hour, which is roughly a 25% reduction of current average grid prices. And then any extra they needed to import at night or whatever would come from the energy supplier at standard grid price. To your other question about did we consider selling at grid parity, we could have done, but that wouldn't have addressed the fuel poverty requirement, which was a fundamental part of the Power to Change Next Gen scheme. So we needed to try and find a way to sell this electricity to the consumers at less than they'd be paying if they bought it from the grid. I agree, if we're just trying to address climate change and mitigate carbon emissions, we should be selling it at the same price as the grid gets it. And then it's that moral decision for people to sign up to the scheme so they know that they're getting as much solar as possible because it's literally being generated on their roof.
Yeah. Okay, great, thank you. And we've got a question from James from Berrylands Community Solar. Would you be able to share some more details about your panel cost modelling? Current costs seem to be about 0.17 to 23, and I guess that's pence per watt. I might be wrong, even at reasonable scale. So I'm not sure if I read that correctly. So James, if you're around, maybe you might want to unmute yourself ask that in the way that it was probably intended, unless Chris, you understand that.
I'm just scrolling down so I can find the
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
Just looking at solar panel pricing at scale, even for shipping it, direct from China, the costs seem to be about 17 to 23 cents per watt, which is quite a different price from what you were talking about. I just wondered.
I mean, those prices were literally those prices were literally taken from the quotation that we were provided by a supplier back in November 2020. Now, as I mentioned, there has been an uptick in panel prices over the past 6 months or so due to ships blocking the Suez Canal and general supply chain issues. So your numbers are probably more current and accurate than mine. I was literally just basing them off the numbers that we'd been given as a quote for a property installation. But yeah, they're in the same order of magnitude at least, which is a start.
Super, thank you.
Thank you. And we've got a question from Fenella. In your experience, would you advise waiting for a couple years to kind of attempt this again whilst things change, hopefully post-COVID, or kind of crack on now?
I think it depends on A, your level of risk, and B, your ability to secure no strings grant funding for capital costs. So we at Low Carbon Gordano, because of the whole fiduciary responsibility and corporate bit, are perhaps a little more risk averse than some smaller community organisations. We don't want to lose people's money that they've invested, and so we might not look at a scheme that just about pays back after year 20, but other groups may go, well, actually, we're willing to take that gamble. So if you are really, really, really happy to take a risk, you could do it now and see if it works. I wouldn't really recommend it personally, but you could. If you can access rural energy funding or some other grant capital funding to slash those panel installation costs, again, modulo the absence of an energy supplier, I think you could do it now. But the energy supplier bit is the tricky part. And I did notice someone mentioned that Co-op Community Energy are still working stuff. Oh, actually, that was David commenting that. So yeah, needing to find that energy supplier is sort of the sticking point at the moment. I think as soon as one of those happens, if you've got access to that grant funding, do it as soon as you can. But otherwise, yes, I'd probably say maintain a watching brief for the next year or so and see in which direction things start moving.
Great, thank you. We've got a question from Penny from Orchard Community Energy. Did you try to involve small private landlords?
We did, and it became quite apparent when we were having a conversation with the lawyers that the lease complexities with that get quite messy. And you also run the risk of a very high turnover of customers. So if you remember, the model depended on effectively not having to lose and sign up new customers on a regular basis for the numbers that we were seeing there. If you've got a guaranteed resident who's a renter and is going to live in that house for the next 25 years, it doesn't really matter. But realistically, people who are renting probably move on every 5 to 10 years to a different property, or the landlord decides they want to sell up. And so it was going to add signing up new people complexity. It was going to add additional financial cost, which then makes the financial model that much harder to make work. And it required a landlord who was willing to sign a lease and then a contractual agreement with the tenants regarding the energy supply contract. Unless you have a landlord who's doing a all bills included within your rent model, but not all of them do. and we would have probably spent 5 times as much money engaging with landlords who said, oh, well, actually, no, I don't want to do it that way, before we found one that said they would. So it's one of those things that, yes, should work, in practice doesn't quite.
Great, thank you. Yeah, we just had another question from James, which it looks like David has just posted a response to, but is asking, did you consider Ofgem regulatory sandbox, in quotation marks, for waiving of supplier regs rather than use an electricity supplier?
I mean, we considered it, but then we would have had to have operated as an energy supplier, which then has that commensurate additional cost for staffing and no longer having mostly volunteers doing the work and effectively having to have a much bigger scheme to make that economy of scale work. So we briefly discussed whether we should apply for sandboxing, but didn't go for it in the end.
Okay, yeah. Got a question from Jack from CSE, which is quite an interesting one, which is asking, would it be possible to combine these installations with a microgrid, which could supply local businesses with electricity, who are more likely to use electricity during the day when the solar is generating? Then presumably you could sell the electricity to the business for a higher rate rather than the lower export rate that you mentioned. Maybe this is just too expensive and complicated, he says.
It's probably possible, but I couldn't unpick the intricacies of it in my head on the fly. Let me scroll down to the question.
Yeah, it should be quite in the recent ones.
Combine installations with a microgrid by local business. Yeah, I mean, that should be possible, but again, it's the microgrid model, which wasn't really the model that we were looking at. But yes, and this sort of ties into the new housing development side of things. So much as none of us want to see random housing estates built in the middle of the countryside, they'd actually be perfect from a microgrid point of view, because you've got a ring-fenced by fields microgrid where you could have that sort of model. And if it's adjacent to a small business or businesses in a business park, that model will work great. And yeah, I don't think it would be too expensive, and I don't think it would be too complicated, but I think you have to find the right location for it. And that wasn't the location or model that we were looking at.
And you need to have appropriate kind of businesses that would want to kind of sign up to that as well, wouldn't you?
Yes, you would.
Who have quite high usage, yeah. Okay, we've got a question from Elliot. Did you survey opinion on separate billing of solar? This would remove the need to engage a licensed energy supplier. Collections could be done by alternative means or supplier.
Yeah, technically that's illegal. I mean, a lot of organisations get away with it, but we were trying to do this so that we could then give it over to other people and not land them in trouble, because you need access to the export meter in order to do the calculated calculations, and you can only have one organisation under the current rules doing any sort of billing from the main MPAN. So yeah, it would have been difficult and probably fraught.
And you mentioned previously in your presentation, you mentioned a few times the local electricity bill. Yeah. Is this something that addresses?
That may, I don't think it explicitly addresses that, but there is a mod that's been put forward to Ofgem to allow multiple organisations to bill from the same MPAN. I can't remember the name of it now. I think split metering or something like that. It hasn't been approved yet, but that would overcome that issue and stop it being a very grey area and make it much whiter. Yeah, I think that mod is probably the main fix for it.
Okay, great, thank you. Apologies, I'm in the office today, so I've got somebody giving some energy advice behind me, but I hope it's not too distracting. I had a question just around the initial engagement that you did, or Lockleaze Neighbourhood Trust did before COVID hit. And, you know, what was the engagement with the community? Were they positively receptive to this model at that stage? And was there anything that they brought up early on that could have potentially been a barrier to engaging them further?
So of the people who attended our events or responded to surveys, yes, people were generally positive. However, you get that thing where often the people that respond to things either really, really love it or really, really hate it. I mean, we had a public event where we presented the scheme and we had 45 or so people turn up, and one participant asked a bunch of really awkward pointed questions and tried to make a nuisance of himself, and everyone else just went, "This sounds great, when can we sign up?"
A really a mix of response then. It's like two extreme ends of the scale there.
The trick is engaging with the silent middle, who don't feel enough about it to actively say, yes, this is great. And you've got to move them from a, well, it sounds like the right thing to do, but I'm very busy and I can't be getting involved in that, to actually, I see why this is going to be good for me. It's going to be good for the environment. It's going to be good for the community. Oh, in fact, because I completely forgot, sorry. The intention at the end of this was to hand the entire scheme over to Lockleaze Neighbourhood Trust to run as a local business, generating revenue for the community. And I can't believe I've spoken for an hour and 5 minutes and failed to mention that in the slightest.
Yeah, thank you. That's really useful. And I guess for me, like an initial barrier that I would have assumed would come up is this inability to switch supplier. And you know, whether you had kind of heard talk of that at the start.
Yeah, I mean, the consumer rights allowing them to switch whenever they want was something that was quite fore in our mind, which is why you have to make an offer that is compelling enough, whether it's due to doing the right thing or saving them money, that they don't want to leave, but also providing good enough customer support that they don't just throw their hands up in horror and go, I never get hold of them, the power's up and down all the time, I'm off, I'm leaving to go to someone more reliable. And that was a knot that we didn't really manage to unpick. It was always going to be a risk that people would just decide they had enough or moved on and moved on, and there was nothing we could do to stop it really, which adds that extra risk and means that your model really needs to be very, very strong to withstand that potential 30, 40, 50% of your customer base disappearing over the course of the 25 years and you having to spend all that cost of sales to rehire new ones in or re-contract new ones in.
Okay, yeah, I can imagine as well, like with the slim pickings of suppliers that would get involved in this, you couldn't really pick the one that has the best customer service necessarily.
Going back to the engaging with suppliers, if we can get 2 or 3 of the greener companies interested in getting involved in this, then at least you can get them to compete with each other, and that will hopefully drive the cost of their offer down and increase the sort of performance that they're offering. But yeah, for as long as it's only one that's interested in talking to you, they've got you as a captive audience.
David's just put in on switching suppliers, offering billing systems that can accommodate third-party solar and community-owned solar will eventually become more commonplace. If you had any thoughts about that?
I think I changed the will to a might, caveat probably will. It's the direction of travel at the moment. Things like the local electricity bill will make it will give the suppliers a reason to have to try and accommodate that. As David highlights, that we could end up with every community energy being a Bristol Energy that collapses, losing millions of pounds. That would completely slaughter the community energy world, which would be catastrophic. But Yeah, I think, am I feeling positive or negative today? Yeah, no, I think suppliers will start, or they and Ofgem will start developing billing systems that can incorporate it. Yeah, the negative one was no, they'll just consolidate their positions and we'll get locked out of the marketplace entirely.
Thanks for picking the positive one. All right, well, thank you for everyone for submitting your questions. We do have some more time for more questions. If you've got any that you want to pop in the chat box, or please raise your hand otherwise. But yeah, I mean, it's been really useful so far. And just to let you all know that we will be posting this whole recording, including the Q&A. So if you ever want to revisit some of the questions that have propped up, you can watch the recording up on our website. And yeah, Vic's just popped in a link to where the recording will be. And yeah, so I mean, if there isn't any other questions, I will pass over to Vic, to Vic to close up and wrap up today's session. But yeah, thanks, Chris.
Great, thank you all.
Yeah, thanks again. Thanks, Chris, for answering all those questions. It's quite a long session in the end. For you, can you just move on to the next slide on the presentation? So yeah, there's our email address. If everyone's got any questions, we can put you in touch with people or share a link to this recording. I'm just finalising the details, but we will be holding another webinar in September, which will be with Justin Bear from Plymouth Energy Community, and they're doing some interesting things on housing. So that will be on new build housing, so that will be really interesting. And we're also hoping to organise one in November with Bath and West, who have been helping householders install air source heat pumps. So that will be coming up in November. So if you do sign up to the CSE Community Energy newsletter, you'll hear about those.